developing each of the railways separately, most of which we understand will be vertically integrated railways. So essentially that leaves two options open. One is what I would call an open access competitive model, where each GCC operator would have the rights of access over each other's railways and compete for traffic on each other's railways, subject to payment of an access charge and subject to capacity being available. The issues with this approach, which is the pure open access approach which has been adopted in the EU for this part of the world, is that it does require some common rules around unfair subsidies and unfair state aids being provided to railways. It does require rules around access charging, and there are issues about at what levels should they be predetermined, or at least what principles should be applied. In the EU, there are principles established in legislation which require railway operators to set access charges at effectively short-run marginal cost, which is really the wear and tear on the infrastructure. Plus, then they can charge a markup depending on what the market can bear, and then charges can be applied for things like scarcity of capacity and environmental factors. So not surprisingly, in Europe, you'll find even though you've got this common set of principles, a huge range of access charges and access charge frameworks. So that's something that would need to be worked upon. You would have long supply lines. So, for example, would a single operator want to operate its own assets all the way from, for example, Muscat to Jeddah, or would it want to enter into alliances and collaborations with other railways? Which brings me on to the final option, which is really an adaptation from open access. And I'd like to stress that Etihad Rail is absolutely for the principle of efficient and unhindered movements of trains across borders. But at least in the first instance, we think that it could be more effectively done by more collaboration between the individual railways and bilateral or multilateral agreements as to how those services will be provided. And the first thing we need to do, and it's something again that Dr. Ramiz is facilitating, is to update, by working jointly, to update the traffic forecasts for GCC rail services, because they're critical for us to understand what capacity requirements are needed in each of the countries to provide those services, what maintenance facilities are provided, where they should be provided, where should the customs and immigrations facilities be provided. In other words, where are the key flows likely to be? We can then start converting that into more detailed agreements between the different countries on exactly what services are going to be provided, and what volumes we expect, the contractual arrangements, agreements on cost and revenue sharing. Is one operator going to provide the whole of the traction and rolling stock across the whole journey, or are we going to share the provision of those sorts of services? And even as far as, for example, for passenger services, are we going to enter into a joint venture agreement to provide the passenger services across the GCC? So the whole range of options, and we're only at the stage at the moment of agreeing on some principles. Then they need then to be worked into the finer details. 2 slides left. One on appropriate regulation. I think Dr. Ramiz has already touched upon price regulation. That we firmly believe that prices will be regulated for rail by and large by the market. We're going to have to work collectively with our partners across the GCC to compete hard with road and short sea shipping transport. We're the last mode to come to the GCC. It's by definition, therefore, at the moment, there are no captive markets. To the extent that captive markets may materialise in the future, My view is that that can be dealt with through competition law as opposed to ex-ante regulation. Access regulation, by and large, will only be required if we go for the more open access model to determine fair access principles and access charging. So, to my mind, given the structure of railways that are being developed across the GCC countries, the main requirement will be for safety and standards regulation. And as I said, I think most of the member states have already endorsed the process-based approach to safety regulation. So really the next step is to develop the details of what safety and operational standards, there was a question earlier about operating rules, what safety and operational standards are going to be needed, which are common across the GCC railways in order to support safe operations. So finally, I'm not going to list all of these, but just some possible roles of a GCC railway authority that we've been discussing with Dr. Ramiz and our GCC railway colleagues. And I've put these into three separate areas. One is a very important facilitative and coordination role which the GCC Secretariat General has been performing. For example, to ensure the continued development and implementation of common interoperable standards, to ensure a consistent level of approach to safety and safety regulation, perhaps the development of common safety targets, operating procedures, etc., etc. A very important role. I won't comment on the extent to which the GCC Railway Authority ought to also have some teeth to enforce these things. I think the recommendations will come out of the study that Dr. Ramiz has mentioned, which again we at Etihad Rail are fully supportive of being commissioned quickly now in order that the GCC Railway Authority roles and responsibilities can be defined and agreed upon. Monitoring and reporting, we would support the GCC Railway Authority having a monitoring role, both in terms of the development and implementation of the projects, but then perhaps in terms of monitoring and publishing reports on performance, whether it be safety performance or other performance measures. And finally, some other functions related to capacity development, sustainability, the issues that Dr. Ramiz has already described earlier, and a role to promote the development of the railways across the GCC. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions if we have time.
Thank you very much. I think we have a couple of minutes, then we have to move on to our panel. But are there any questions people want to raise? Dr. Ramiz. While the microphone is moving over there, can I just say that I hope respectfully on the GCC list that hopefully the Luxembourg Protocol is on that list somewhere, because I think it'll make your life a lot easier actually.
I'll talk about it later.
Thank you. In fact, there was a previous question and discussion on how to develop, the projects, and we mentioned, having the champions and people in place to basically advocate. And Mr. John Thomas is one of them, sitting there with Etihad Rail. He's been, and his team, very instrumental really in developing all of that. Second thing, I thank you so much for really giving insight into the two common guidelines for the coming stages of the operation and institutional setup. And in fact, it entices people to know more about, the details of those. And I encourage everybody to seek the formal channels to have open discussion with the authorities in the different member states to really learn more about these two common guidelines in the current stages, because this is important, that it is shaping the agenda of the railway development in the region. But that also tells you how complex the issues are. And we've been tackling several of these issues, such as, for example, open access for the past 2 years, and we are still negotiating and discussing to come to a very clear understanding and consensus what it means and how it applies in the terms of the GCC railway sector.
John, I hope this is still working. As I think you know, there's been a huge controversy in Europe concerning the fourth railway package and the way that we have to separate out infrastructure and operations within the railway community. How far do you see that, firstly, is desirable, and secondly, whether that model should be followed here, or whether one should use a different model?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it depends on a number of factors, including the structure or the development of the market. So, for example, for me, the principal driver of separating operations and infrastructure is that you can introduce competition above the rail, the competition between different railway operators. And in the textbooks, of course, that tells us that is the most desirable market structure for consumers, because it drives efficiencies and better performance and lower prices, etc. But in rail, it also introduces what I would call an artificial separation of two components of a system, and a very important system. And my experience in the UK, one of the issues we had in the UK, I was the rail regulator for 10 years, was that it introduced a misalignment of incentives between the railway operators, who are purely focused on their market, and the infrastructure manager. Now, I'm not saying that they can't be overcome, but as a regulator, we spent most of our time trying to think of clever ways of putting incentives in place to bring back the operations and the infrastructure. And just to give you one example, in the southeast of England, there was a procurement of new, much heavier passenger rolling stock, had air conditioning units, etc., which were going to have to draw much more power from the grid. Now, there wasn't effective communication in place between the infrastructure manager and the train operator, so what happened, the trains were delivered and were just in the sidings for, I think, at least 12 months, because there wasn't sufficient power supply, and the assets weren't sufficient in order to support this new rolling stock. It doesn't have to happen, but it's one example of some of the misalignments of incentives and perhaps inefficient investments that can be made if you separate the system. So you have to be sure, I think, that the markets are big enough to sustain, to allow effective competition above the rail, in order to outweigh some of the possible disadvantages of vertical separation. And to my mind, at the moment, we don't really know how big the markets are going to be for GCC railway traffic, and therefore certainly Etihad Rail's view is that, at least in the initial phase, we should keep the railways vertically integrated, and that we should cooperate with our railway partners in order to determine what railway traffic there is, and then to come to bilateral and multilateral agreements between us to operate those services.
Okay, because I mean, as you know, in Europe, there are some strong advocates of your position, I mean, particularly in Germany.
Yeah.
And the European Commission has sort of tried to sweep these aside. Do you think the Commission is wrong? Do you think that approach of separation really doesn't make sense for the reasons you've just given?
Well, I wouldn't. No, not necessarily, because Europe's a very different market. I think there are flows in Europe. You have for example, dense areas of population which can support very significant numbers of trains and potentially competition. And even in the UK, where competition, I'll talk about passengers because it's largely a passenger network, competition largely has been for the market. So competition for franchisers to operate for between 7 and 10 years, and those franchises generally are not overlapping, so you don't generally get direct on-rail competition, even in the UK, where you've separated infrastructure from operations. So one of the main benefits that is meant to come through vertical separation in terms of direct head-to-head competition doesn't exist in the UK. So
in Italy it does, funnily enough.
Absolutely. So I think that's my point. I think it can work, and certainly the ORR were an advocate of more competition in UK rail. And where limited competition has existed in passenger operations, you have had some significant benefits. So what's happened is that private sector operators who are not operating in a contract with government have identified niche markets where these markets were underserved, from large conurbations to London, and they've offered more innovation. They've grown these markets by 3 or 4 times the growth of existing markets from franchise operators from similar places. They've offered lower fares. Their service quality has been good. Their passenger satisfaction scores are consistently in the 90%, way above the franchise operators. So I think competition can certainly bring benefits, and it really depends on the structure of the markets, to my mind.
Okay, thank you. I think we should stop now. John, thank you very much for fascinating presentation. I'm sure there may be other people asking you questions over lunch.
Sure.
But good luck. I know you've got a lot of work ahead of you to get this all into place. And thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our final session before lunch, and again, I'm sorry we're running a little bit late, but hopefully you won't be eating the tablecloths, and we'll manage to get to lunch reasonably quickly. We have a final presentation, a panel discussion. I'd like to ask Dr. Khan, please, to come back and join us on the panel. Dr. Ramiz, if you could join us as well, please. And I leave it to you, Mr. Al-Alayan, if you want to join us or not. That's up to you, as you wish. Separate project management team to actually implement rail projects. And I promised to come back to, and I'd like to ask at least a couple of the members of the panel to comment on this in due course. I promised this morning to come back to the issue about variation orders, how you actually change a project during its inception, rather than hopefully deal with everything beforehand. There are going to be some changes in how you deal with that. But I think the first question, I think, to each of the panelists should be what the optimum mechanism is to actually put these kind of projects in place. They're vast projects. They have considerable obviously financial investment. There is a whole area of interoperability, interconnectivity, which means you cannot work in isolation. So there are some really significant challenges on putting these consortia together, and also to actually design a proper project management team to command and control how those consortia work. I don't know, Dr. Khan, do you want to start off and just say, from your point of view, how you can run those systems effectively and the project management teams effectively?
From the project management side, I think, especially in the Middle East, I mean, you have to bring the team together, and right now it's a challenge to get a combination of sufficient expertise, at the same time the local representation, because part of the challenge is to actually transfer the technology and train the people who are actually local engineers, supervisors, etc., who are going to be in the long run be looking after not only the construction but also the maintenance, because this is a very important factor. The other thing that you just pointed out, what is the impact of variations, etc. Especially, since we were the first one to start, and we find that it is inevitable that there are a lot of variations which needs to be considered, considering the local environment. Because one of the very important thing is that whatever works in Europe or in States does not necessarily mean that it's the optimum solution for for the GCC countries or for the Middle East. This is very important, and that flexibility has to be there. The understanding has to be there, and it's a combination of the client, the consultant or engineer who's supervising the work, and the contractor. And unless you have this very clear understanding what everybody's role is, but at the same time, what is their joint role in order to make sure that the project is completed with the optimum results to the best benefit of the end user, rather than just getting stuck with some of the things in the specifications, because specifications are written in different places and different environment, and they are being employed. So the local materials, local things need to be looked at with open mind.
Okay, John, maybe you could comment on that a little bit as well. I mean, the British are very good at, in the railway industry at least, is showing how not to do things, and then everybody learns from our example how not to do it. Obviously, we've got some things right, but in terms of project management, actually, you've been around in the UK where you've seen major changes in the railway industry there, and perhaps you could comment from your perspective, firstly, how in Europe people have got it right and got it wrong, and certainly in this region, what the optimum structuring should be.
Well, certainly in the UK, as you well know, we have very prolonged planning rules and regulations, which at the start of the project, at the initiation, even at the when the project is being defined and the feasibility study is being done, can go on for years and years. And we saw the example of the big example is Terminal 5 at Heathrow, which was 10 years at least in the planning. So we have various planning rules and regulations that perhaps need to be refined and improved in the first place. There's then a number of issues that I guess we've had in the UK, and whether we've taken advantage enough of common specifications rather than actually having to build and design our own things specifically for the UK, and that's often an allegation in the railway industry. Now we do suffer from a legacy issue. So for example, the railway's been built in the Victorian times with the bridges and tunnels and such like, which then when you want to upgrade generally means that it's more expensive to do so. But I think the classic problem that's been discussed of not tying down the specification, design and specification alignment of a project early enough, and that then you get continual changes and variations, which, as Dr. Rami said earlier, by and large just does tend to increase the cost of a project. But at the same time, and issues that certainly discussed internally within Network Rail, you have to identify what are the elements of the project which do need to be tied down today. So, for example, on the Etihad Rail case, the core route of the network and the design, the alignment and the design and the construction of the core route. But as I said earlier, at the moment, what we have is a number of memorandums of understanding with future potential customers. We don't yet know the detailed requirements in terms of the facilities that are going to be required for each of these customers. So at this stage, it would be impossible to set out the detailed specification and the design of the facilities for customers. So it's identifying, I think, those elements which do need to be tied down now, and those elements where you need to leave some flexibility within the contractual arrangements or to contract at a later stage for their design and implementation.
That's an interesting comment. It's something, I mean, on the financing side, I often come across in the context of BOT programs, because you tend to fix things too quickly, and maybe that's one of the reasons why the Saudi project didn't work as well as it could have done, because once you've set it in stone, of course, any change thereafter becomes very expensive, and you need flexibility as you develop the project. But as you say, you need to have points of solidity which don't change, and a penumbra, if you like, of flexibility which can change as you move on, because obviously people still learn. We don't all have the ready cut solutions for everything. Dr. Ramiz, would you like to comment on that as well?
Actually, the two issues are, I see it very much interrelated,
Yes.
on the management team or formation of it and the variation orders. If I may say a few things on the management team, that one needs to set up expectations. We need to be realistic, and I will explain that. We need to have a transition plan, and then we need to delegate but hold responsible. What that means, what's happening in the GCC countries now, yes, we can do it. We have sufficient expertise in-house, and they form teams. Maybe it doesn't have the skills required or the skill mix that is required to really have a competent management team to follow and be a counterpart for even, the gurus who could come into the industry and they take them in all directions. This is a real problem that we have, and if we are realistic and, basically we delegate but we hold responsible, and we have a reasonable expectation of what we can do and what are the gaps, and we can enforce it, I think that will be a very successful model, and we've seen it in